I'm Tim, guitar player, teacher. In our last video, we discussed how to read pitch using several clefs. Today we'll be looking at rhythmic notation and how to read and count rhythm. Now, while the position of the note head tells us which note to play, the appearance of the note tells us about the rhythm. Rhythm is the timing of music. Basically, when a note should be played and how long it should last. And just like time in normal life is measured using seconds, minutes, hours, etc., we need a way to measure time in music. The way we do that is with a beat. The beat is just simply a repeating pulse. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow, but it needs to be at an even, consistent speed. All music has a beat. Now, looking at any piece of music, it is very easy to see that the notes are separated into sections by thin vertical lines. These lines are called bar lines, and the sections they create are called measures, or bars. Each measure will have the same number of beats in it. The thing that tells us how many beats are going to be in each measure is called the time signature. The time signature is found at the very beginning of the piece. It's two numbers stacked, kind of looks like a fraction, and each number tells us a different piece of information about the beat. But for now, I only want to focus on the top number. It tells us how many beats are going to be in each measure. The beat needs to be counted based on this number. So if it's a 3, that means there's 3 beats in each measure, so we'll be counting to 3. If it's 4, there'll be 4 beats in each measure, so we'll be counting to 4. Now, a vast majority of the time, there will be 4 beats in each measure. This is just simply the most common arrangement of beats in modern music. So for a majority of our examples, we'll be dealing with 4 beats in each measure. It is so common, in fact, that 4 beats in each measure, or 4/4, is often called common time and is marked with a big C. I mentioned in the last video that the other parts of the note, the stem, flags, and beams, tell us about its rhythm. So it's the overall appearance of the note, or which of these pieces we use, that tells us how long that note should last. Here are the most common types of notes with their names and durations. A whole note is only a hollow note head. It should last for 4 beats. The reason it's called a whole note is because it gets the whole measure. A half note is a hollow note head with a stem. It receives 2 beats. If a whole note is worth 4, then a half would be worth 2. Next is a quarter note. It has a colored-in head with a stem and is worth 1 beat. An eighth note is worth 1/2 of a beat, so there are 2 of them in each beat. For this reason, when we write them, we typically connect the 2 notes together with a beam. We don't have to, though. We could write them one at a time using a single flag instead of connecting them. Either way, they last the same amount of time, so there would be no difference in how they sound. A 16th note is worth 1/4 of a beat, so there are 4 of them in each beat. And just like the eighth notes, we use either beams for groups or flags for individual notes to show what type of note it is. The only difference is for 16th notes we use 2 beams or 2 flags. Now notice that every time we go to the next note, we are cutting the previous note in half. In fact, we could continue to make smaller and smaller notes by simply adding more beams or flags, and every time we do, we cut the note in half again. 16th notes are usually the fastest notes we see, though, so we'll stop there. Well, along with these types of notes, we have what are called rests. While a note tells us how long a note should last, a rest tells us how long to be quiet. The rests are named and measured exactly the same way as the notes, they just have different symbols. Here are the rests that match each of our notes. Now let's look back at our time signature. While the top number tells us how many beats will be in each measure, the bottom number tells us what type of note will receive each of those beats. In other words, there will be this many of this type of note in each measure. The bottom number will only be one of a few options. If it's a 1, then you're counting whole notes. If it's a 2, you're counting half notes. If it's a 4, you're counting quarter notes. If it's an 8, you're counting eighth notes. If it's a 16, you're counting 16th notes. So if your time signature is 4/4, or 4/4, that means there are 4 quarter notes in each measure. If it was 6/8, that would mean that there are 6 eighth notes in each measure. 2/2 would tell us there are 2 half notes in each measure. Now, this sometimes does have an effect on how we count the rhythm, but the overall principle of counting to whatever the top number is remains true. This can get very complicated at times, so for now, like earlier, we're going to be sticking with 4/4 because it is the most common time signature that we see in modern music. In order to keep up with the beat and figure out the right rhythm for the notes or rest we're reading, we need to count the beat. In fact, the counting actually gives us labels for the timing of the notes and rests. Think of it like a timeline. For our example, we will again have 4 beats per measure, so we'll be counting to 4. A whole note will start on 1, and because it needs to last for 4 beats, it won't stop until the end of 4. Now, since there are exactly 4 beats in the measure, it will last for the whole measure. Again, that's why it's called a whole note. A half note will last for 2 beats, or half the measure, so as long as we are counting, it's pretty easy to keep up with not only when the note begins, but also when it should end. In this case, the first half note will start on 1 and end at 3, and the second half note will start on 3 and last until the end of the measure. Remember, the notes have to last the right amount of beats, and the next note, whatever type of note it is, can't start until the previous one has ended. Quarter notes, being worth 1 beat each, or a quarter of the measure, will happen 1 per beat. For eighth notes and 16th notes, we have to create divisions within each beat to account for the much smaller and faster notes, but they do still need to be counted. At this point, rhythms can get pretty complicated, but counting is still the key to understanding the timing of the notes. And those are the basics of reading musical rhythm. Along with the pitch of the notes, this is how music is read. And while there are lots of other symbols used in reading music, these 2 things make up the bulk of it. As I said previously, knowing how to read is just as important in music as it is in language. I highly recommend taking the time to familiarize yourself with it by simply reading music. Even if the notes are not being played or heard, being able to simply recognize which note is which will be imperative to understanding the rest of the videos in this series, or any music you ever see for that matter. Our next video will be creating the major scales. These major scales become the fundamental basis for virtually everything else in music theory. Until then, thanks for watching. I appreciate you taking the time. Take care.